I love your minimal facts approach. Well, it's pretty amazing, but it's often misunderstood. And so it's misunderstood by skeptics and even by some Christians. And so help us to understand this. Gary, how do you define a minimal fact?
Yeah, I use two criteria, and I want to be clear about this because a fellow just wrote a critique, an unbeliever just wrote a critique of my argument for the resurrection. And he said that my argument is fallacious because it is totally based on something as a fact because critics say so. All right, that is totally false. It is not my argument at all. I have two steps for when a fact is historical, when it makes the grade. And the first one is when every fact you use, every morsel is backed up by multiple evidences. Now, that's not to be confused with the criterion multiple attestation. Multiple attestation can be multiple facts, but there's a lot of data. Say for the empty tomb, I produced over 20 arguments for the empty tomb using an uninspired, critical New Testament that non-Christian New Testament scholars would use. Over 20. Now, a lot of those are the texts, but a lot of them are not the text. So the first point is I'm not going to use any facts which don't have multiple facts in their favor. Now, the second distant criterion is because the facts are so good, critics allow these to be used. Almost all critics allow these to be used. But that's not the reason. Of course, it's fallacious if I use facts only because people who don't like my arguments use these facts. Well, they could be wrong, or they could give them up tomorrow. The fact that they will grant these different evidences simply means that we can get the argument started more quickly and can get into it without them objecting to every point. But by far, as I say always, by far the main reason for accepting these facts is that there's multiple reasons for each one. In fact, I'll tell you, McKellen, the big book that you just mentioned, just under 1,000 pages, I have 6 facts. And of course, they're not just 6 loner facts. They're the data that back up the 6 facts. And each of those 6 facts averages almost 15 independent reasons for holding those facts. 15 arguments a piece, and I repeat, 15 arguments apiece, the way critics count facts. Someone who rejects inspiration, rejects, let's just say they reject the authorship of the 4 Gospels, the traditional authorship, at least Matthew and John, and all they give you is Paul's seven of his 13 epistles, and they will grant these facts. So I use those facts to go after their counter theories.
So let's briefly mention those facts. I'm glad we're clarifying that here because it's really the number one way I think that people tend to misread your work. You're not just making an appeal to authority, okay, right? You're not just appealing to scholars. You're not just saying these are facts because these critical scholars say so.
That's a joke. It's just not true, but we hear it a lot.
Yeah. So you're not saying that these things are facts just because some critical scholars say so. You're saying that the evidence is so strong historically that even those critics, people who don't accept the resurrection, even they have to admit, they have no choice but to admit that these things, if they're being honest, that these things are actually historical facts. And in your book, you lay out the top 6: the death of Jesus, the disciples' belief that they really saw the risen Jesus, the early preaching of the gospel, the transformation of the disciples, and then, of course, the conversion of the church persecutor Paul and the skeptic James. Now, you've often recommended starting with Paul, and I found it's really helpful advice actually in my spiritual conversations with skeptics. I love using the minimal facts approach and starting with Paul, but tell us why you like to start with Paul.
Because the hardcore critics, here's the good part. They'll give you Paul. Here's the bad part. He's often the only one they will give you. So, and then when I say Paul, there's 13 books in the New Testament that bear Paul's name. They will let you use 7 of them. And Bartimer, for example, others, almost every New Testament author who writes an introduction where they're trying to tell you what's going on in New Testament studies, they'll tell you that 7 of Paul's books are fair game. And what's interesting is that if a conservative pastor who believed the Bible was the Word of God was going to preach a series of messages for the church on what do we know about Paul and his epistles, these are the same 7 epistles he would want. And the 7 they grant, and you say, well, 7 out of 13. What if they take some different ones than 7? No, it's always these 7. And the 7 are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians. Then you have to skip over to Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and the little non-theological book, Philemon, 1 chapter. So the big 6 then would be the first 4, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians, and then Philippians, and what most New Testament scholars think is the earliest New Testament book, 1st Thessalonians. Those 6, they basically won't argue with you if you use those 6. Now, when I say won't argue, that doesn't mean everything in it is true. They just mean Paul was a scholar. I like to say Paul had a PhD in Old Testament. He was a Pharisee. He was a scholar. He wouldn't lie. He might be wrong, according to these critics. He might be wrong, but he wouldn't intentionally lie or mislead you. He believes in objective ethics, so he's a good person to cite because he's a good guy, and he at least thinks he's giving you the data. So they'll say, use those first 6 books, Philemon, if it helps you, but use those first 6 books. And I do. I usually make the main point on the resurrection from both 1 Corinthians 15, first 11 verses, and the end of Galatians 1, the beginning of Galatians 2, which there's no chapter division there in the original. So that's 2 texts, 1 Corinthians 15, Galatians 1, the beginning of Galatians 2. Those texts alone, and the critics grant that data for you.
Wow. So, one thing most people I talk to don't realize is that critical scholars who study the historical Jesus actually read the Bible. They don't read it as a spiritual authority, of course, but at least they read it as ancient documents. And when Christians talk to people on the street or in coffee shops or at work, they find that most people don't really know very much about the Bible, and they don't know how history actually works, how historians study figures in ancient history. So how can we respond if someone says, well, you're just quoting the Bible and I don't believe the Bible? So are we stuck when they say that? How would you respond?
Well, yeah. And you know what? They say that all the time. Mostly the crowd that calls themselves scholars that do not believe that Jesus ever lived and that Bart Ehrman makes fun of for 20 pages in his book, Did Jesus Exist? And Ehrman says of the thousands of individuals who make up the society, well, the 2 major societies, the critical societies, he said there are thousands of professors who teach in this way, and he said, I don't know one of them who thinks Jesus never lived. So right away, and he goes off on all their sources, and he says, these people are upset that we don't use their books, and their books are self-published, and they call themselves scholars, and he uses some really strong language, but he goes off on them. But that's what you hear a lot. They're the ones that speak the loudest and the most shrill voices, it seems like, and they just go, as one guy just said to me recently about this big book, he said, it's a bunch of garbage. It's a cult. You're only quoting the Bible. Okay, great. Well, that shows you don't know how to do research. I don't say that to him, but the problem is, if you ask Bart Ehrman or Gerrit Ludemann when he was alive, or any of these skeptics, Jewish scholars who are New Testament specialists but are not Christians, you ask them what sources they use. Gezer Vermesh passed away a few years ago, and Pinchas Lapid did a few years ago, 2 Jewish New Testament scholars. They both grant all this. And here's Bart Ehrman's comment. It's brilliant. He says, I'm asked, do I accept Paul because I accept the Bible? And therefore, I'm prejudiced because I think the Bible is the Word of God. He said, let me ask you a question. He said, if I'm going to do a book on the Revolutionary War in America, and I want to get eyewitness sources, and George Washington is still alive, do I cite George Washington because he's prejudiced and he won the war and he was the first president? or do I cite George Washington because he was there, he's the biggest name, he was a leading general, and he knew what was going on? He said, I quote Washington because he's a first-rate scholar, not because he's an American and I'm an American. That's not why I quote the Apostle Paul. That's kind of how the critics do it. They're using the best sources, and you can use almost any critical source. Jesus Seminar guys, they're going to say, Paul is your best source for Jesus, period. There's virtually no debate on it.
Yeah. Well, it's hard for us to put ourselves sometimes in the shoes of a skeptic, but it's also tough for people who aren't Christian in this conversation because many of them, I think, don't know that the Gospels, and especially the writings of Paul, are taken seriously. And this is really the best documentary evidence for the life of Jesus. And so that's why it's taken seriously even by atheist scholars, other critical scholars who don't accept the resurrection, but do want to know what Jesus actually said and did. And so this is why we do the work that we do as historians. And now I remember you mentioned the mythicists, or I call them the Jesus mythers. I do remember how Ehrman told the Huffington Post once that you might not like established religion, but he says, surely the best way to promote such an agenda is not to deny what he says virtually every sane historian on the planet has come to conclude, whether we like it or not, Jesus certainly existed. And that's coming from an atheist. But really, to deny that Jesus is a real figure of ancient history is conspiracy level stuff. So it's kind of like saying 9/11 didn't happen, or that we never put a man on the moon, right? But now I've talked to people who acknowledge the fact of this case, like the crucifixion, the disciples' belief that they truly saw the risen Jesus, and even the conversions of Paul and James. So some people will acknowledge these facts, but then they want to push back on the resurrection itself and say something like, I don't know what they saw, but it certainly wasn't bodily resurrection. Or so maybe they'll say it was hallucinations, or maybe they'll say they had visionary experiences and then they began to proclaim Jesus as risen from the dead. That's why they say Jesus rose from the dead, either because of hallucinations or because of visionary experiences. How do you engage with those kinds of objections?
Well, it depends on what the mood is, how the previous conversation has gone, what looks like the best place to jump in. I could say a bunch of different things. One thing I'd say is, you said vision or hallucination. If it's, let me just take one of those two, vision. What kind of vision would it be? If they said, oh, I don't know, like when somebody sees a ghost, an angel or something, I'll say, well, let's talk about it. Was Jesus really there when he appeared? If they go, maybe, then I take that as a starting part and I go on. Well, do you know that the appearance to the 12 is the best attested? You know that Paul knew all this. Paul met Jesus, other people were in the group with him, but he went to Jerusalem and checked it out with the biggest named eyewitnesses in the world, namely Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John. They agreed with his message in Galatians chapter 2. So if it's that, now you have to account for a really existing something. What if 5 people saw an angel in the living room and you think they're all nuts? Were you drinking? Were you on drugs? What's going on? But you could theoretically get some data from people who saw this thing at one time. If they go, no, it's an hallucination, then I bring out the passages. A lot of Christians don't know this, but many of the appearances, of all the appearances, there are more appearances to groups as defined as 2 or more, like the 2 guys on the way to Emmaus in Luke 24. There are more appearances to groups than there are to individuals. And in the creed, that early creed, 1 Corinthians 15:3, you'll almost find no scholar that will almost nobody will take that, won't take that as a very early report by the best eyewitness around, Paul. Of the 6 appearances there, 3 of them are to groups. Now, Paul adds his own name at the end in verse 8, but 3 of the appearances are to groups. And so right away, you start with one of these early appearances list of appearances that the Jesus Seminar says Paul knew about on his way to Damascus. And by the way, Mikel, we often talk about, well, the story keeps getting bigger and bigger as it moves on. The book is later, so there's more story to it, more mythology. 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following is the longest list of appearances in one context in the New Testament. It's also the earliest list of appearances. So that turns the criticism on its head.
That's right. Yeah. And so if Paul is actually quoting this creed, we know it had to be around before he wrote 1 Corinthians, and he had to know about the resurrection. He had to know about the resurrection reports before he followed Jesus, because what was he persecuting, right? He was persecuting the resurrection preaching that the apostles were saying they were telling people that Jesus appeared to them. And so he was persecuting that resurrection preaching. And he also had to understand that, I think, to see Jesus and know that he was seeing the risen Jesus on the Damascus road. And so I think he had to know it just to understand what he was seeing then when Jesus appeared to him.
Yep.
So I think this puts the formulation of this creed basically at the foot of the cross.
It does. It does. Yep.